So I think that when it comes to Afghanistan, two things can be true at the same time. And don't get me wrong, I do not say that to take some cringe, like nuanced, centrist stance on the situation where I'm like, oh, but some of both sides are true. Okay, don't get me wrong, I despise centrists. I think centrists are irrelevant and ultimately contribute absolutely nothing to the real political discourse in America. But the reason I say that is because I think in this case, that is genuinely true. It is true on one hand that the way in which Joe Biden withdrew from Afghanistan was idiotic, it was incompetent, and it was just a complete disaster. But I think it's also true on the other hand that out of the fallout of this entire situation, you are seeing a lot of Bush-era anti-Trump, America last neoconservatives basically use the opportunity to kind of re-hijack the narrative and insert their decades-old talking points back into the conversation that we thought we had basically gotten rid of under the Trump presidency. And we know that if these people had their way, we would be in Afghanistan for another 20 years. We would never left Iraq. We would essentially stay in all of our foreign wars, past, present, and current forever in this false vision of a global American empire of democracy. And we can't let that happen, and we have to push back on those people. But I'm concerned, and the reason I'm concerned is because I see a lot of, genuinely Trump-supporting conservatives, sort of people who identify as, MAGA conservatives, kind of getting on board with these talking points and getting on board with these people simply because the neocons are now bashing Biden, and because their talking points are anti-Biden, many sort of gullible Trump supporters just assume, oh, well, this must be MAGA, this must be America first, when it is literally not the case. And we have to stop letting neocons kind of hijack this conversation from where it needs to be. And so we're going to be talking about both of those things in this video, as well as ultimately the coming refugee crisis that you're definitely going to see in America and Europe pretty soon. But before I begin this video, I think we obviously have to address the elephant in the room, which is, as you can see, that was our last video in California. We are now out of California. We're in the great state of Florida. I have set up a temporary, impromptu content kitchen behind me. And by temporary, I do indeed mean temporary, okay? Currently, what we are using, you probably think I'm on a desk right now, but it's not a desk. It is an ironing board. We're using an ironing board as a desk. That's how just freshly moved in we are, but we're still making the content. We love to see it, right? So I don't go to the University of Florida, by the way. That's a psyop. It's an esoteric psyop, which we'll explain later. But for now, what I will say is that I think Tim Tebow is an inherently right-wing symbol. And now that we're in the state of Florida, I think we have to shill for him. And it's just so true. It's just the case. Also, I know that we have a lot of new subscribers from the live stream on Brandon Tatum's channel last night. And so stick around to the end of the video if you're brand new, because I want to talk to you. And I think I have kind of a message for you guys. But welcome to the channel for now. Okay. Into the topic of today's video, I think we obviously know it to be the case. We're all in agreement that the way in which Joe Biden withdrew from Afghanistan was a disaster. Obviously, you have to get your equipment out. You can't be handing our equipment over to the Taliban, essentially. And obviously, most importantly, you have to have a plan to evacuate American citizens. Okay, we have left a bunch of Americans stranded in Afghanistan, of all places. It's a disaster, and you're probably going to see kind of an Iranian hostage crisis 2.0 with the Taliban arise out of it. And it is just idiotic. It is just insane that Biden basically never had a contingency plan to get Americans out. You have to get our equipment out. You have to get our citizens out before you can get the military out. Okay, and so we know this to be the case. I think also this whole situation, as whatever you really think of it, is very, very discrediting for the American regime and the supposed expert class that we've put in charge in our country. Because one of the big criticisms of Trump, and one of the things that Biden campaigned on, ultimately was trusting the experts. And that didn't just pertain to science and those issues of the COVID-19 and all that stuff, right? It also pertained, if you remember, over the past 4 years, it had a lot to do with like our intelligence agencies in the military. It was a very common criticism of Trump that he's undermining our intelligence agencies. He's not trusting our intelligence, right? He's not trusting the experts in the national security state and all these places. And you've seen their utter and complete failure. We know they're out here saying, well, maybe 2 to 3 months, maybe it won't happen at all. Biden was out here saying there's not going to be any collapse at all. And I believe the sum total was 11 days, right? It took 11 days, which every single national security expert said there was no way you could have predicted this. 11 days for the Taliban to take over Afghanistan. which is very discrediting. And it's very discrediting for the people who literally shill for the American regime and literally shill for these people, you know, CNN, all these entities. But I think also at the same time, we should really there should be a silver lining out of this entire situation, which is that I think it is something as conservative Americans should be a little bit white pilling for us. And I'll explain why. I'll explain why out of this whole situation, because we obviously know at the end of the day, this is the situation we're dealing with now, where the true target of the American regime is not the Taliban or anyone else. It is really us, and it is people like us. It is conservatives. It is Trump supporters. It is Christians. It is straight men. It is, you know, I'm not white, but obviously really white people as a whole, right? That's kind of, that is who's really ultimately going to face, I think, the biggest arm of persecution from the American regime. And when you look at the way things are around the country, it really feels like everything is hopeless. Our backs are really up against the wall. But then you kind of look at what happened in Afghanistan. And this is not me in any way trying to, like, you know, support or defend the Taliban, but you look at the failure of the American regime, the failure of the globalist American empire in such like ridiculous fashion. I mean, they were embarrassed so bad. I wouldn't even say the United States of America was who really got embarrassed. I think it's the globalist American empire, the American regime, which is a fundamentally anti-American, anti-national, post-national entity that I have no allegiance to, and I absolutely always root for their failure. You saw their utter failure, right? The fact that the Taliban, here's a ragtag militia force that, you know, basically fights out of caves and lives in caves, was able to retake their country after like 20 years of being airstriked and bombed and all this stuff, you know, is able to retake their country in 11 days. Again, I'm not supporting the Taliban. I'm not supporting violence. I'm not supporting their methods. But it is to say that I think the silver lining of the entire situation should be that, yes, while we ultimately, at the end of the day, are the main targets of the American regime, and they have a lot of power on their side and they have a lot of everything on their side, we should remember that, as we see with their failure in Afghanistan, they are not invincible, right? They're just not invincible. And to be frank, they're not always competent with their power either, which means that when it comes to not the physical war, obviously, but the culture war, the political battle, it becomes very obvious that perhaps we still do have a chance. Perhaps we still do have a dog in this fight. And perhaps it is the case that the American regime, evident by what just happened, isn't actually as strong or as like all-encompassing as we seem to think it is. Okay? With that being said, let's actually get to, I think, my main point in the video. And the thing I'm really concerned with is that neoconservatives quite clearly are hijacking and retaking this narrative. So notice what I said about how Biden's withdrawal was a failure. Right? I said it was a failure because he didn't have a plan to get our equipment out. We have citizens stranded there. We have this like last minute evacuation from the embassy, which is really bad optics really on the world stage. But notice what I did not say, which is simply the fact that the Taliban ended up taking over the nation of Afghanistan. That is something that I think to be completely fair to Biden, and I don't say this to try to be fair to Biden, I really say this to try to push back on the neocons, is the fact that this is one thing Biden is right on. Regardless of whether we withdrew 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years from now, it is simply the case that at the moment we withdrew, it was inevitable that the Taliban would have retaken the country anyway. That is simply the case, okay? And quite frankly, yes, there are things Biden could have done better, maybe things Biden could have done to delay the process, but it is simply inevitable that the Taliban would have retaken the nation anyway. And I think the supposedly conservative people should stop pretending like had Trump withdrawn or whoever, or had we simply been in charge, you know, that's not something that would have happened. And that's Biden's fault that happened. That is not his fault that happened. Well, at least in this context, right? This is the reality that we talked about this on a live stream last night. We talked about this in the Mitt Romney video a few months ago, that ultimately the population of Afghanistan, and this is really not something that a lot of Americans out of kind of that sense of American ego want to admit, but it is true. The actual people of Afghanistan were not appreciators of the Western-style democracy that we set up for them. They're simply not. They're not appreciators of feminism, you know, en masse. I'm sure there's some people that were on board with it, but en masse, they're not appreciators of all this stuff, okay? Ultimately, you look, and this is something we brought up before, but democracy, as much as it is praised, as much as it is whatever, and ultimately we are not really even a democracy, we're a republic, but, you know, democratic systems in general are not universal. They do not work in all societies. They barely work here. But you look at kind of the history of America and who is kind of the population of America. You know, it is true that at the time of our founding, the ideas of the U.S. Constitution were fairly revolutionary for their time. But there are also limits to that statement, because you look at kind of what the U.S. grew out of was the 13 colonies and kind of England, right? And so we were a population for 300-400 years that had lived under the idea of English common law. Even if it wasn't directly representative, had parliament abroad, and we had many state legislatures and, kind of representative government already going on at home. And then we end up adopting this republic. Meanwhile, you look at a nation like Afghanistan, okay? And let it again be reiterated that democracy, republic, whatever, is not a universal system. Let it be reiterated that governmental systems don't arise out of nowhere. They arise out of, centuries of kind of history and heritage and culture and societal consensus that ultimately form the consent of the governed, right? So that's to say that there's probably a reason why the Taliban and many radical Islamic governments have control in the Middle East, because to a large extent, even if it's not directly what the people want, in a way, it's what's kind of necessary to govern those societies, right? So let it be pointed out that when you look at a nation like Afghanistan, here's a population that historically has never even really been united, right? It's kind of a colonially border-drawn country. So we don't even have a united, kind of cohesive population with a common identity, first of all. But then you combine that with the fact that this is a population that has never been governed by a democracy ever, any type of democratic system ever, never had any concepts of democracy, never had any concepts of like a Western civilization, Western heritage. And when I even say Western civilization, I'm not even talking necessarily about the GAE, right? The modern West that is just absolutely terrible. Even Western civilization at its peak, at its kind of that ideal kind of like Christian society, that still is not something that, like a 99% Muslim population would ultimately subscribe to. And so this is kind of long-winded, but it's all to say that the system, the government that we set up in Afghanistan was ultimately bound to fail from the start, okay? You are not talking about a population that was ready or even just willing in general to accept democracy, feminism, or any of the nonsense that we tried to set up there, And I said this in the last video, and it's still true, that if we really wanted stability in Afghanistan, and we really wanted to leave behind a government that would actually be effective and actually be able to hold power, what we should have done is install an autocracy, a dictatorship. That's what I mean. If you want to keep Afghanistan stable, ultimately you have to recognize that democracy inherently in any country is not a stable system, but in some countries more than most. Because if you're talking about a population, again, that does not have common interests, and they're very divided, and has a history of being governed by basically violent warlords, what makes you think as soon as you hand those people the U.S. Constitution, they're just simply going to be okay? Yeah, it's just not the case, okay? And so that's all to say that perhaps there was a reason why the Taliban was in control of Afghanistan, and before the Taliban, entities like the Taliban were in control of Afghanistan to begin with. And let it also be said that as much as people don't want to admit this is absolutely true. Even if we saw it as, well, we're liberating Afghanistan, we're giving them democracy and feminism and equal rights, the reality of the situation is that is not how the vast majority of the population of Afghanistan saw it. By Pew Research, Afghanistan is a country where 90% of the population supports Sharia law, okay? Does that really look like a country to you that's going to magically kind of embrace the modern American way of life? No, it is not. And the reality of the situation is there is absolutely no way that the Taliban could have continued a 20-year-long insurgency like that in the way that they did without local support, right? It's the same thing as the Viet Cong, okay? So that's the reality. And that's something that, again, out of that a sense of American ego, a lot of people are not going to want to admit, but is absolutely true. The people of Afghanistan did not see us as liberators. That is the reality. They did not see us as liberators. Instead, they saw, most of us, I know some of them did, but most of them actually saw us as foreign invaders. And I know this to be the case. You know how I know this to be the case? Because as soon as we left, look what happened. Look what happened. The government that we left behind, the military that we left behind, many of which had pretty good technology, was far technologically superior to the Taliban. Did they actually attempt to put up a fight? What essentially happened as soon as we left? What essentially happened when we said to the Afghan people, okay, well, we nation built for you. Here you go. Here's the keys to the kingdom. What do? They literally basically handed it over to the Taliban. I mean, that's what you saw. You literally see And even in this case, that famous video at the airport, you see a bunch of young fighting age men are not resisting the Taliban, but essentially trying to flee, right? And so that's all to say that when you look at the fact, and this is just the reality, the Afghan people ultimately have some blame to share in this. And if it is the case that they want the Taliban and they want that kind of rule, I'm not really one to judge, because I think different civilizations and different societies have to be governed by different rules. And if you really understand nationalism and self-determination, this is just simply the case. But if it was supposedly the case that the Afghan people en masse, they all love our system, then why didn't they do anything to defend it? Why did the Taliban, how were the Taliban able to take over the country of Afghanistan in 11 days, if not for the fact that, quite frankly, most of the population of Afghanistan was either indifferent or outright wanted that system of government and outright hated the system of government that we left behind? Genuine question. And so that's all to say to the neocons. Stop pretending as if the Taliban taking over was not an inevitability. It was. And most importantly, stop pretending like this sort of virtuous, and maybe you view it as virtuous, whatever, system of democracy that you're trying to spread around the world is going to work. It is simply not. This is an outdated Bush-era delusion. It is basically a conspiracy theory at this point that as soon as you hand all these Muslim countries, the U.S. Constitution is just going to work out fine. It's just not the case. Okay? It's just not the case. And that's what's really concerning to me, though. I mean, you see people like Dan Crenshaw and Nikki Haley kind of retaking the narrative on this issue. And obviously, as a result of it, you see a lot of MAGA conservatives saying, hey, you're bashing Biden. I like this, right? But it's very concerning to me. It is very concerning to me to essentially watch this. And I think this is almost maybe kind of the goal of Joe Biden. I don't know if it is the case, but you are seeing as a result of this, by proxy of the Democrats, by proxy of Biden screwing up in Afghanistan, by proxy, you're kind of seeing Republicans slowly shift back into becoming the pro-war party. And that's what I'm concerned about. That's what I'm concerned about, seeing these types of people and these types of ideas really take back a platform. Because if we know anything, and if we learn anything, and if you're a supporter of Donald Trump and you're a supporter of the sort of revolution and political movement that he led, we know it to be the case that we're all about basically more or less isolationism, right? We're all about nationalism. We're all about America first and not nation building in other countries. And you are seeing a lot of people who basically this is what they want. They're going to make excuses. And basically their central premise is that we should have never withdrawn at all, right? That's essentially what people like Dan Crenshaw think. And he basically said this outright. We should not withdraw from these nations at all. If we essentially don't push back on this at the same time, we are going to see these voices and this kind of pro-war, pro-empire party become the reality of the Republican Party again. And I simply cannot allow that to happen. True patriotism, I think true nationalism, a true recognition of American exceptionalism recognizes that America, and as bad as we are at this point, and as much as our civilization has basically descended into hell, it is still true when you look at something like our system of government that our nation and our civilization is unique. You cannot copy-paste us into Afghanistan and expect to create a bunch of mini Americans. It's just simply not the case. Okay, it's just simply not the case. But anyways, so I know I also said that I was going to discuss, the migrants and the coming refugee crisis that we definitely have in our hands in this video, but this video is already getting kind of long, so I figure we'll just kind of extend it and wait until the next video to talk about that specifically as its own video. But what I would like to point out in closing here is really a comment on why it is perceived to be the fact that we have lost, quote unquote, in Afghanistan. To be quite frank, I would argue, I know this is going to be a really crazy statement, that we actually won the war in Afghanistan, and we won it a long time ago, okay? And the idea that we actually have lost the war in Afghanistan is an idea that is ultimately written by a combination of both neoliberals and neoconservatives alike. Let me explain what I mean. By that I mean that when we first went into Afghanistan, our goal was not to nation build. Okay, our goal was simply, and this is what most Americans essentially thought we were doing, was to take out the perpetrators of 9/11, to take out Al-Qaeda, to take out Osama bin Laden, and we know that we did that. Al-Qaeda is an irrelevant force, and that happened in a few years. Osama bin Laden was killed back in 2011. But the reason why we essentially lost this war, quote unquote, is because the goalposts shifted, and we willingly shifted those goalposts. Initially, what was the goal in Afghanistan? To take out a strategic enemy. That is something we could do. That is something that the U.S. military was fully capable of. But then it shifted. Then it turned into this kind of neoconservative and Bush-era goal to create a democracy. Right, to create a Western-style liberal democracy featuring feminism and pride in the nation of Afghanistan. And that is something that the U.S. ultimately was not capable of. You know, maybe we actually did have the resources to do it, but empire is costly. Empire is extremely costly. And it ultimately was not a burden when you look at the amount of foreign aid and the 20 years of occupation that we had to do. The American people were not willing to accept, which they should not have been willing to accept, because America is not an empire. America was never built to be an empire. We were built to be a nation state. We were built to be a republic, right? And you can see that in the American ethos. You know, we were not the British Empire. Even at the times in our history where we flirted with colonialism, you know, it's always been something that's been kind of controversial. We've never really been willing to kind of go all out in terms of imperialism, because it's just not, that's not built in the American ethos, right? That kind of contradicts the idea of e pluribus unum, out of many one. It contradicts the fact that we are a nation that was kind of founded off of anti-imperialism, founded off of nationalism, right? And I think if you're truly if you truly kind of believe in America and the American spirit and American values, what you should support around the world is truly the consent of the governed. What you should be supporting around the world is not a American-style democracy, quote unquote, which we don't have in every nation. What you should be supporting is the ability for each nation to dictate its own destiny, right? And when it comes to the issue of foreign policy, we should be fighting enemies, not building up nations for other nations. And I would say ultimately this is the big difference between the Cold War and the post-Cold War, and this is a big reason why people like Pat Buchanan, you know, the paleo-conservatives ended up splitting from people like George H.W. Bush, was this difference in vision of what America's role in terms of foreign policy and on the world stage was. Because you look, during the Cold War, even people like Pat Buchanan recognized the threat of the Soviet Union, recognized the threat of communism, but the American sort of role during the Cold War was more to defeat an enemy, right? It was just to basically stop and contain the spread of communism. Okay, it was not this necessarily spread any type of Western-style democracy. You look at places like South Korea, South Vietnam, you know, a lot of the places we've sort of propped up, you know, Cuba under Batista, right? It was not a matter of, well, we need democracy, right? No, it was simply to stop communism. It was not to build anything up or force our way of life on anyone else. It was simply to stop a strategic enemy, which is something that America is fully capable of. We are good at actually taking on our enemies directly. What we are not good at is really trying to tell other countries and tell other peoples how to run their lives and how to run their country, which is much different. And we actually kind of recognize, hey, you know what? If we hand South Vietnam a democracy, what the heck is going to happen? Yeah, maybe kind of a more authoritarian system is actually kind of not just more within our interest, but kind of more what's needed there, right? That's the difference. And ultimately, yeah, South Vietnam ultimately still was a failure, but on the topic of nation building, that's really the difference. And I would say that's the big difference between a paleo-conservative and a neoconservative when it comes to foreign policy. It is this vision of, first of all, is America a republic or an empire? You know, that's first and foremost. But on top of that is the goal of America when it comes to foreign policy, the defeating of enemies to stop enemies, or is it the building up of the rest of the world? Is it this globalist vision of a globalist American empire? That's the difference. If you're a supporter of Trump, if you're a supporter of 2016, I think you should know where you stand on that question. I think it's really just common sense. If you say you're America first, if you say you're whatever, it should be common sense what the correct stance on that really is, okay? And we can see it play out in practice. But anyways, that'll wrap up this video. But before you go, I wanted to say this because I know we have a lot of new subscribers, like almost 1,000 of you guys actually, from Brandon Tatum's live stream last night. By the way, we hit 10K because of you, so thank you, Brandon Tatum. Thank you to his fans. But I would like to say that, you know, I think because the audience on Brandon Tatum's channel is a little bit different than mine, there's something that needs to be said, which is that on this channel, I think you're going to hear, because I think the audience is a lot more sort of mainstream. I mean, my audience is already kind of on board and is used to this stuff. But to my new audience, a lot of the things that you will hear on this channel will very likely challenge, the mainstream conservative narrative a lot, right? And they will likely challenge probably a lot of beliefs that you may hold yourself. I do not do this, by the way. This is not that my beliefs are more liberal than the mainstream conservative. It's actually that they're more conservative, right? I guess you could say we in this collective community are a little bit further to the right, and we're not any like crazy name or anything like that, but just ideologically, I think we're a little bit more aggressive, a little bit stronger in our approach to things. And I would say that I fully encourage you to kind of approach the content and approach the points on this channel with an open mind, right? With kind of some openness, because I think it is the case, and this is a big reason why you will see me on this channel basically call out kind of the conservative establishment, kind of try to push the narrative in the Overton window further to the right, is because I think we're all in agreement, right? Whether how old you are, how conservative you are, we're all in agreement that conservatives right now in this country are losing, and for the past few decades, we have been losing big time, right? And so I think it is the case that when you look at the way things have been going, ultimately the status quo in the kind of conservative movement is not working because we are losing. And so I think it is the case, and I know this is something that will be sometimes uncomfortable for some of my audience, some of my new audience specifically, but I think it is the case that ultimately, because of that, the only solution is that we have to begin questioning the mainstream narratives. We have to begin questioning the conservative establishment, asking why they failed, and perhaps present new, many times much older, just kind of before fusionism and neoconservatism came around, but essentially more or less new solutions to the problems or new approaches than ones that we have been doing for the past few decades. So I fully encourage you to stick around, really hear with an open mind, but also know that you will probably hear on this channel a little bit more dissent to establishment conservatism than you will normally hear. But trust me, this is all strategic, this is well intended, and I promise you, if our sort of side of the aisle really gets its way, you're actually going to see an effective conservative government. And actually, I think as a matter of fact, I'll probably do that as a video coming up soon, and it's kind of good for a new studio anyway. I'll probably do a video. It might be kind of a video to kind of like 5 new things conservatives should believe or consider, one of those list style videos, but in it, I will basically kind of break down and explain kind of what I believe and why I believe it. And so I've kind of explained the strategy of the populist right and kind of this new movement, which again, you're fully welcome into. Most of my audience is young people, Zoomers, but we fully welcome people of all ages and we love to see it. But anyways, guys, thank you very much for watching. The Florida Content Kitchen is open, okay? We got to fix it up a little bit. I mean, it looks kind of ghetto right now, but it actually doesn't look that bad. But we got to stop recording on an ironing board. But soon, we love the state of Florida. We love to see it. Be sure to become a member for more exclusive content. I have a video on Asian Boy Autumn that is a response to John Doyle's video on White Boy Summer. That will be a members only video coming out soon. So be sure to become a member. Click the join button next to the subscribe. And if not, still, I appreciate it. Be sure to leave a like on the video and everything else. But until next time, remember, folks, Florida mode it's not imminent anymore. It is simply underway, okay? Asian Boy Autumn coming soon. And see you guys next time. Alpha Moves only, and peace.